Good evening and welcome to edition 2 of 2020 Vision, the Vodcast news magazine programme coming to you every Tuesday at 7 o'clock. We invite you to ring in and share your concerns and stories about coronavirus here in East London with us and our two special guests. We have Gary Stevenson, who is an inequality economist, talking about the effect of coronavirus, the pandemic, on the UK economy and on people's pockets. And after that, we'll be coming to Tom Zagoria from the Labour Homelessness campaign, who's be talking mostly about the effect of corona on rough sleeping in Tower Hamlets and East London. So do ring in. I'll put your comments on the Vodcast Facebook page, and we'll get going with our guests. We need to look at today's headlines. There's now 1,789 deaths been reported in the UK. That was at 5 o'clock yesterday. And that's a staggering increase, up 381 on previous figures. Worldwide, we have seen 38,000 deaths now, and only 170,000 people have actually recovered out of some 800,000 cases of corona, the rest still being ill. So that having been said, let's turn now to our first guest. So the question I want to start, well, first of all with Gary, is just to introduce you. Gary, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, like economics? That's just like a really dry, boring topic, isn't it? What on earth drew you to economics?
Well, I mean, I've been working in economics for a long time. I grew up in London. I was very good at maths, and you sort of get pushed in that direction. But I studied maths and economics back at university in London, at London School of Economics. I graduated in 2008, which was the time of the last crisis. And I worked for 6 years as a trader in London and Tokyo, looking at interest rates and asset prices and basically making forecasts about the economy. And over that period, I started to realize that inequality, which is not spoken about much when you study economics at university, I think it actually has a very key part to play in the performance of the economy and the performance of asset markets. I think basically you can't really predict well or understand well what's going to happen unless you understand how inequality and distribution will be affected. And I think that's why most economists are very bad at predictions, and I'm better at it.
Hey, okay, well, you can predict a few things for us tonight, Gary. Well, obviously we shouldn't make light of this subject. I mean, some of us would say that what we call the global economy couldn't survive without inequality if you look across the world. Would you agree with that?
That's a big question. I mean, inequality has always existed. It exists in every country, in every time period you want to look at. Personally, I would argue that if you want to find examples of successful economies, obviously what you call a successful economy depends on the person. But for me, it's one where working people can relatively comfortably afford a good quality of life. They can get good housing. They can have security. The economies that have produced that have generally been economies with lower inequality. Obviously, there's always inequality. Most of history has been a period of very high inequality. But if you look at the periods where we had lower inequality, the 50s, 60s, beginning of the 70s, these are periods where housing was more affordable. And since we've seen inequality go up and up and up, I think that is associated with most particularly weak performance of wages and very unaffordable assets. And people talk now about unaffordability of housing, but if you look at the more unequal places in the world, such as Mumbai, big cities in China, you'll find housing is even less unaffordable. So whilst I think that inequality is probably something that will always exist in some form, it varies greatly. Sometimes it's small. And,
you see, I have this, I'm not an economist at all, but I have this theory about the housing crash, the crash in the housing price market, that the government, although it's recognising the housing crisis in the UK, can't do anything about it because it can't afford to let house prices fall, or the economy could collapse again. Is there anything in that, or am I just making it up?
I think definitely falling house prices causes a lot of economic problems. I mean, that was a big part of the cause of 2008. We all saw that. If you allow house prices to fall simply by itself, it can be very, very problematic, as 2008 shows. But of course, from my perspective, I would say high house prices are in and of themselves not a problem. They're only a problem when wages are also not high. So if housing is expensive, but everybody's making a lot of money, then it's okay because people can afford them. The problem is that, especially since 2008 and a little bit before, house prices have gone up and up and up and up, and wages haven't. We don't really need to bring house prices down if we can bring wages up.
And can we? Can we bring wages up in the UK?
I think it's possible. I think especially relative to house prices, it can be done. So what I always look at is this ratio. This is the house price relative to the wages, And obviously, since 2008, we've seen those house prices go up while wages have stayed the same. I think that could be very relevant here. I think what happened was in 2008, a lot of money was printed. And that's relevant because that's happening now at a very rapid scale. Most economists will tell you when money gets printed, prices go up. But after 2008, a very interesting thing happened, which was certain prices went up very, very quickly. Stock prices went up very, very quickly. Gold price went up very quickly. House prices went up very, very quickly. But wages and prices in the shops didn't really move. So I think that the reason for this is largely we can understand if we see who were the recipients of that printed money. And that's also relevant in this case. If the money goes largely to rich people, they tend to buy assets with most of their income. So if money is flowing to rich people, you will see assets become more unaffordable. So I think if we shift the direction the money is flowing, so that more flows towards ordinary working people, you'll start to see those wages come up and catch up with the house prices.
Okay, so that would be one way of doing it. And for us in the UK, is that the point of Brexit? I mean, many of us didn't understand the point of Brexit, but is that what we're trying to do, to reduce the number of migrants working in the UK who are pulling wages down and therefore allow wages to rise? Is that going to help?
Well, Brexit's obviously a very big, thorny issue. I suspect if you asked 20 people what's the point of Brexit, you'd probably get 20 different answers. Yes. Yeah, so the point of Brexit, it really depends who you ask. There's clearly a lot of issues involved in Brexit, and I would argue many of them are economic. But as an economist, I would have to accept that there's definitely a lot of issues which are not purely economic, which are driving Brexit. I do think that living standards have been struggling for quite a while in the UK, and that's part of the reason why people are discontent. And to vote for Brexit was a very big economic risk, and people don't normally vote for big economic risks if they're happy with the economic status quo. So I do think that inequality and the effect it's had on wages and the affordability of housing and the economic performance of some smaller cities in the north of England and other parts of England, those are big issues. They're economic issues. They're related to inequality. But of course, there's lots of other issues as well, social issues, which probably I wouldn't be expert to comment on.
Okay, so let's go back to this printing money again. I mean, obviously, you're right. We all remember in 2008 when you were graduating, but not cause and effect, I'm sure, that governments across the world were printing money. Well, what's wrong with that? I mean, money's what we need, isn't it?
Yes, that's a big question, and it's super, super relevant right now because this is another incident where the government, or to be more accurate, the central bank has responded by printing huge amounts of money. And it's not in and of itself bad. I mean, there's clearly a huge problem here now, and there was a huge problem in 2008. I'll focus on the money on the situation now, since it's more relevant to what's happening. Still printing money. There's a huge economic problem. So I can't really talk about the medical problem. That's obviously foremost on people's minds. But I'll talk about the economics. There is a huge economic problem, and in a sense, it's very, very simple. The spending has absolutely disappeared in the economy, and that has caused a lot of people's jobs to quite simply disappear, and a lot of people's incomes to disappear, and that in and of itself is a disaster. If you don't have any income, you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your bills, you can't eat, and these people desperately need money, basically. So the central bank and the government have stepped in, basically together. The central bank's printed money. In a roundabout way, they've given it to the government, and the government is giving it to these people. And to be honest, it's hard to argue with that. It simply has to be done, given the situation. It simply has to be done. But it creates problems which will become more apparent down the line.
That's where we need to go. And speaking of lines, I just want to remind our listeners that if you want to ask Gary a question about the economy and the economic consequences of the corona pandemic, call us in the studio on 020 8 12345 07. So we're here if you'd like to call in and ask a question. But going on to talk about inequality, Gary, I mean, I'll put to you another idea. Up until corona struck, inequality in the UK was perhaps between the south and the north, maybe between BAME communities and white communities, maybe between men and women, all sorts of inequalities coexisting and melding together. But perhaps what we're going into now is a situation of inequality between those in work and those who are not in work. Some people in work, such as those in the public sector, at least for now, are still having their 100% of their wages. But some of those who are not in work can't have their wages topped up by the government, either by loans to the employer or directly. They're going on benefits. That's where they're headed. So is that the new inequality now between those in work and those out of work?
Well, one big element of this crisis is the enormously unequal way in which it hits the economy. So for a lot of people, really, their economic situation is not particularly changed. A lot of people are working from home. They're still getting their ordinary income. They still have the same expenditures, still got to pay the same money. But another person may well have completely lost their job and have absolutely no income at all. The government has done its best to step in and resolve this. They've obviously offered to pay 80% wages to a lot of people, and they've come in now and also help the self-employed. There's still gaps in that scheme. People who are recently self-employed are not well covered. Small business owners are not well covered. People who might just have been between jobs are not covered at all. People who lost their job just before these measures came in are completely missed. So there's still a lot of holes, and a lot of people are going to be really struggling here. It's created a lot of inequality. Yeah, and yes, go on.
No, I was going to say. So, I mean, we're hearing now. Do you think we're hearing now of various job losses? And I'm wondering if you think it's maybe the tip of the iceberg, or if it's just a few lame ducks, as we used to call them. British Airways is no longer operating out of Gatwick. That came out today. So there's airline staff are on unpaid leave at the moment. Carluccio's went over the edge today. Do you think there will be more bankruptcies and companies ceasing trading? Is this the tip of the iceberg, or are we going to survive?
I think there definitely is going to be more, assuming that these lockdowns go on for some time more, which it looks like they're going to be. It's only been just over a week now, and we've already seen companies going under. There will definitely be more. And to be honest, it very much is in the lap of the government, because absent any government intervention, an enormous number of companies will go bankrupt here. An enormous, an unbelievable number of companies. So at the moment, the small companies, whereas individuals who have lost their jobs are getting 80% income, small companies are only eligible for loans. Now, there's a big difference between a grant and a loan, and that's going to become very, very important here, which is if you get 80% of your income given to you, you can probably survive. But if you get 80% of your income loaned to you, you're in big trouble in the long term here. And a lot of these companies are going to find that even if they do survive, they'll survive with enormous debts after this. So if the government is insisting on only giving loans, and a lot of companies will go bankrupt.
Well, that's not a problem surviving on loans, is it? Hasn't the entire success of the current US economy has been based on loans, hasn't it?
It isn't a problem. So a big problem with what happened to the Japanese economy in the early 90s, when they had a huge asset price crash, was a lot of these companies and a lot of individuals were sitting on enormous loans. And the company was profitable, but they had a big debt that they could never pay back. And the owners of these companies and the people who had these debts, they naturally responded by completely stopping their spending for a long period. And if we are moving into a situation where a lot of companies have huge debts, a lot of individuals who are slipping through the gaps of the safety net have huge debts, and possibly most importantly, the government is racking up an absolutely enormous debt itself supporting this, then it's going to weigh on spending for a very long time in the economy. And ultimately, spending is what drives wages. So it's going to weigh on people's wages too.
So there's a number of questions arise, but basically you're thinking, are we in for another decade of austerity here in the UK? Is that be a good measure? Is that how the government recoups its debts? Well,
that is a very big question. I'm not a political forecaster, but we can all look back at 2008 as a good example of what happened. There, the government debt increased a lot, and they responded by doing a long period of austerity. Now, there's been a lot of discussion since that about whether that was out of necessity or whether that was a political choice. Because what we're seeing happening here is a huge printing of money from the central bank. It raises the question, if the central bank will continually print money and give it to the government, does the government ever need to pay its debt back? Does the government ever need to reduce its spending? To be honest, I think permanently sustaining the government with printed money is a bad idea and could lead to big problems. But we also see that the interest that governments have to pay at the moment on their debt is extremely low. So governments probably can survive with quite a large debt burden because the interest payments are very low, but it will continue to hang over their heads. The debt doesn't disappear. The problem really is that, just as we've seen with Japan, which has been a similar situation for over 30 years, the debts stick around for a long time, and it's always there. This debt could still be here when our grandchildren are walking around,
Yes, well, in my case, that'll be a lot sooner than yours, I should think. But is this a problem? Japan, as you say, around 30 years of, I don't know what the current interest rates are, but I remember them being at around 0% for a decade or so, wasn't it? So they haven't gone away, but that's just like sort of, there's a lot of dust on top of my cupboard, I'd better get it off one day, but actually you never do. How has it affected the Japanese economy to have this debt in the background?
Well, when you talk about Japan specifically, it seems to be a relatively good example of a national government that is able to sustain very high levels of debt without really seriously affecting their government finances. The interest they pay on it is low. It does add up as the debt builds up. So, part of the Japanese taxpayers' taxes goes towards financing that debt. But because the interest rate is very low, it's not a huge amount. So Japan would seem to suggest you can sustain a very high government debt. But there are obviously plenty of examples of countries that have failed to sustain a high government debt.
Such as?
Well, they're generally countries that are not as wealthy on average as the UK. So we're talking about South American economies, Asian economies, which have been very much damaged by their debts. In some of those cases, the debts have been in foreign currency, which makes it a lot more difficult to manage because you don't have your own central bank that can print it off. But even in the case of a country such as the UK, it could cause problems. So the government, it doesn't owe that money all to the central bank. A lot of it is owed to private investors. If those guys withdraw their support, then the interest rates could go up. When you have a very big debt pile, if the rates start to go up, it can cause problems. Of course, the central bank can print money then to give you it back, but that could cause problems with a falling pound, increase in inflation. It might be manageable, but it's not an ideal situation.
Yes, this is it. I lived through the Thatcher years. That was when I started becoming politically involved in Tower Hamlets, the Thatcher years. And the thing that we were always told from the right politically was you can't borrow because you're just racking up debt and interest that you have to pay back. And back in the day, to an extent, that was true. my parents bought a house in that period of time, and they the hilarity of it was the house cost them, and it wasn't in London, £6,000. And 10 years ago, I bought a car that cost more than £6,000, but they had to pay 20% interest, and so they found that very difficult for a long period of time. But that it sounds to me like, on the one hand, what you say could be an easy answer, print money. It's like building a house of cards. It could fall at any moment.
And I think when you look at printing money, it sounds seductively free, but it's very important to realize that somebody ends up with that money. And if that somebody is not you, you could be in trouble. Because even if your situation might be completely unchanged, if the guy down the street has suddenly got £1 million, and lots of people have that, well, they're going to start buying things, and they might be buying things that you wanted to buy. They might buy the house you wanted to buy. They might be buying the stocks and shares that you wanted to buy for your pension, So what we're going to see, I think it's very, very important to understand where this money is going. So the central bank is giving it to the government, and the government is giving it to ordinary working people. And those people are using it to pay their rent and to pay their mortgages. And by that mechanism, it's ending up with rich people. Normally, these rich people spend a lot of money, and that pushes it back round. But these people have completely stopped spending. So essentially, the problem comes when these people stop spending, governments push new money in, and it's ending up with the rich. So huge amounts of money are going to pile up on their bank accounts during this period where they're not spending.
And I asked an economist once, I'm sorry, Gary, it wasn't you, it was somebody else, who actually has got all this money, because all the governments are busy borrowing, and I don't know which country they're borrowing from. And the person I spoke to said they're not borrowing from other countries. Virtually every country is in debt. They're borrowing from rich individuals. So in the scenario you've just painted, if the wealthy amass vast stores of capital, they're just encouraged to lend it back to the governments again, and that house of cards becomes even more unstable.
Yes, but to be honest, my worry more than lending back to the governments is I suspect they'll use it to buy people's houses. And we've spoken about people who are slipping through the cracks of the government scheme here. There's small business holders who are forced to take out loans because they're not getting grants, and banks are asking for them to put their personal houses down as collateral. Yeah. And also there's, people, as we mentioned, people who are between jobs, people who've recently lost their jobs, self-employed people who haven't got enough history, who are not going to get any income support. Some of these people will have to lose their houses. And at the same time, rich people are amassing huge amounts of money. Banks have completely stopped offering mortgages, so ordinary people can't buy houses anymore. So house prices are going to fall, just as these rich people are accumulating huge amounts of money. These guys are going to buy the houses from desperate people at super low prices. And if 2008 is anything to go by, in the next 5 years, these houses could double, treble. So we're going to see houses move from the most desperate in society to the richest in society, just before asset prices will probably go through the biggest boom they've ever seen. After 2008, we saw the biggest ever sustained increase in asset prices in recent history. That will probably happen again. So we're going to see assets move from the poor to the rich, and then a huge boom in asset prices, which will make the rich richer and make housing even more unaffordable than it already was.
Well, thanks for cheering us up, Gary. That was an excellent job there. Last question. Is it then time to pick up Jeremy Corbyn's call for a 4-day week? And instead of dividing society into those who have work and those who don't, maybe we should share the work between all the workers. And if at the end of the day that creates the same national output, we can afford to pay ourselves the same national wage. Is that a way forward?
I think the 4-day week campaign is a really interesting campaign. It's one I've been involved with for a bit. Oh, yeah. I think, if we reduce the amount of work being done overall, it kind of helps to form, in a sense, a national labour union. If we all stop working, then we stop competing with each other and we force wages upwards. And it also helps redistribute work, because we do live in a country where there's a lot of people who don't have as much work as they would like. And there's also a lot of people who have to work much, much more than they would like. I used to work in the finance industry, so I know what that kind of life is like. So I do envisage a possibility where a 4-day week could lead to a much fairer, more equitable outcome in society, but it's troublesome to implement purely in and of itself. I'd need to have a full look at the system. There's a lot of people, for example, there's a lot of people who they need all the money that they're getting now. And a lot of the calls are a 4-day week with the same pay. If that could happen, then it would be great. But I'd need to look through the full proposals just to make sure that we weren't damaging some people who really, really do need all the hours they're getting.
A lockdown for a few more weeks yet, Gary. So maybe if you could go away and have a look at that 4-day week, you'd be very welcome to come back and talk to us about it in more detail, because I do think it's a very appealing idea. Share the work and use more people to create the same output, although obviously there's a lot of other ideas. Are there any, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you have a burning desire to say or to open up? Any cans of worms you've brought with you that I haven't opened yet?
Not really. I've managed to say my piece about basically inequality. I'd just like to make people doubly aware that printing money is not free. If money gets printed and you don't end up with it, somebody else had it, and they'll probably buy the things that you want. So I'd like people to be aware that this will probably lead to another big step upwards in house prices. I would encourage any people out there, if at all you can, don't sell your house because it's not the best time for it. But I understand for a lot of people there won't be a choice. No, that's it. Maybe a very quick word on bailouts.
Yeah, go for it.
There's a good chance that a lot of companies will be bailed out in the next few weeks and months. I just think it's important for people to realise there's a big difference between bailing out the workers of a company and bailing out the investors of a company. Governments tend not to get the best deals when they do bailouts. If a company is bankrupt, then the company is worth nothing. The company is worth less than its debt. So the government should be able to take full control of that company and also force the bondholders, the people who the company owes money to take a loss. If the government doesn't do that, then it's basically paying taxpayer money to wealthy investors. So I would encourage people to keep an eye on bailouts as they come out and to encourage the Conservative government to make sure the taxpayer gets a fair deal and not just the wealthy investors.
Hey, okay, lovely. Gary, it's been brilliant talking to you. I hope that you'll come back again during the course of our lockdown. In a second, we're going, sorry, I'm just reaching out for a bit of paper here, so I'm knocking my lights off my little shelf. In a minute, we'll be back and we're going to look in more detail at housing from the point of view of homelessness, which is another social issue that could arise. And also, I'd love to hear from you if you're listening and you'd like to phone in. I know people are always shy about phoning in, but I'm going to annoy the back room now and put up a picture of this. Have you had this lately? There we are. We've all had a letter from John Biggs. And I know a lot of people are calling it John Biggs's door-to-door corona delivery service because the virus can survive on paper for up to 24 hours. But I have left mine for 24 hours before picking it up off the doorstep. So if you think this is a good use of taxpayers' money, or if you think this is a poor use of taxpayers' money, ring in. We'll be looking at that after a very short advert break, after which we'll be joined by Tom Zagoria from the Labour campaign against homelessness. So for the moment, Gary, we'll see you soon and thank you very much. And we'll go to an advert break now. Thank you.
Occasions Live, specialist in live video production. Broadcast your event with HD Live. We use multiple cameras to give your event the cinematic quality. We cover all types of events from corporate to private. Call us on 0208 1234507. Email us on info@occasionslive.com. Find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
Hello, welcome back after that short advert break. And we're using the same technology as Occasions Live use, so do bear us in mind if you'd like to, while we're all on lockdown, join in this kind of interaction, just to make it, to welcome Tom Zagoria from the Labour campaign. I think it's called the Labour campaign on homelessness, isn't it? I'd rather think of it as a campaign against homelessness, but you've chosen a different proposition, I believe.
We are against homelessness, I can confirm that as well. But yeah, Labour homelessness campaign or any variation is fine.
Good. That's very relaxed of you say. We'll be talking about how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting homeless people, at least in the UK, in a moment. But I just mentioned to our viewers, have we all had our leaflet, our letter from Mr. Biggs, signed at the bottom there, so we know it's definitely from him. And what do you think about that as a handout? I've had a quick look. There's nothing on homelessness there. So could you just sort of set the scene for us a little bit, Tom, we will sort of start with our guests asking them, what drew you into campaigning against homelessness? Why, out of all the social ills, did that one strike you as something you wanted to do?
Well, for me personally, and I think for a lot of homelessness activists, I personally had some lived experience and close family experience of homelessness, and I think we kind of seen in the UK specifically, it's so clear that this is a politically motivated crisis which has been going on for a number of years. Mm-hmm. So the impacts of austerity, the impacts of completely unequal economic and housing system, just shows that this is something that we could change if we act in solidarity with people who are marginalised rather than just stigmatising them.
Mm. I should remind our viewers that, of course, we are not in the same room. Sadly, I'd much prefer to run this as a face-to-face interview, but obviously we're both in our own different homes. So when you started work on homelessness, Tom, when you first came to Tower Hamlets, what did you find? Does this borough have a serious homelessness problem or not?
So it absolutely does have a very serious homelessness problem, and it has also a rough sleeping problem, as in the most extreme form of homelessness. So not just sofa surfing, but people out on the streets in specific areas. I think I found, especially living on the Isle of Dogs, as Jenny likes to talk about quite a lot. It's quite strange seeing just to the north of us this whole Canary Wharf privately owned public space where there doesn't appear to be a massive rough sleeping problem because it's simply shoved out of sight. And I think unfortunately that has been a part of the strategy of Tower Hamlets Council, as with a lot of boroughs, is trying to push the problem out of sight using the Vagrancy Act and all forms of sorts of criminalising measures. But absolutely, there is a homelessness problem. I don't think Tower Hamlets Council is the worst borough on this by any means, but there is clearly not enough being done.
Yes, I mean, those of us who have walked around the back of the London Hospital of an evening, any evening over the last 2 years, have become very conscious of the rough sleeping issues in Tower Hamlets. I mean, is rough sleeping concentrated in Whitechapel, or is it popping up all over the borough? How do you see that?
There's a lot of it in Whitechapel. I haven't got the Tower Hamlets borough figures quite in my... Well, so there's a lot in a lot of different... I think Shoreditch has quite a big concentration as well, the parts which are closer to the City of London. But I think we just see different concentrations in different wards of the borough, and a lot of it is going to be not quite so visible as well, because a lot of rough sleepers don't want to be found. There are going to be different concentrations of areas where people are going to be begging a lot, and you are going to see that. But there's also areas where people are going to be squatting. People are going to be finding other ways to survive in a economic system and in a sort of degrading welfare state where it's not possible for people to have secure housing.
And is this unique to Tower Hamlets, or how does Tower Hamlets compare with the rest of the country? I mean, we know that the people in the north are politically disengaged from... Tom, someone's washing up in the background, and I think we can hear them a lot. Could they possibly leave it till later?
Yeah, sure.
Right. Okay, washing up must always be done, ladies and gentlemen, but not always live on air. How do we compare with outside London?
So within London, that is the sort of most extreme end of the UK's homelessness crisis by a long way. I think what we are seeing, well, actually, since the impact of the coronavirus crisis, we're seeing in a lot of London's sort of outer boroughs, visible homelessness is actually decreasing, because a lot of rough sleepers who have no other source of income because they're not engaging with services beyond donations from the public moving steadily towards the centre, where there has been slightly more footfall for slightly longer. And so there's a lot of people concentrated in Westminster now. But across London, that is the most extreme end of the homelessness crisis. Tower Hamlets is absolutely not alone. A lot of these central London boroughs have been spiralling more and more out of control in the past few years. But in really all of the UK's major cities, rough sleepers are having to go to those areas. And I think one other thing I would note is even the parts of the country which don't have as much of a visible homelessness crisis, quite often those areas are Tory boroughs. Those areas are places where all of the shelters have been cut rather than just most of them, where there is no charitable or council provision whatsoever. And so people in desperation have to go to these larger cities to find support. So those parts of the country which have a more significant homelessness crisis aren't necessarily doing worse at it, I suppose. It just shows that it's a national crisis.
Okay, right.
Getting concentrated.
So the political and economic situation which makes people homeless is driving homeless people into rough sleeping in the corona hotspots, really?
Yes.
So how has corona affected rough sleepers?
So it's causing a humanitarian crisis by any means, and it's something that is getting worse and worse. What we're seeing, it's a bit strange, really, because we've seen a lot of media reports coming out, stuff in a lot of Guardian articles saying the government is committed to ending all rough sleeping. I think the last deadline they set for themselves was last weekend, and this is all under their new COVID homelessness czar, Louise Casey, who was actually Tony Blair's homelessness czar, has been brought in to advise the government. Ugh. And then we've had a lot of announcements like this saying homelessness can be ended, we'll end rough sleeping in one go. And what we're seeing, to be honest, is a lot of people are believing that. A lot of very well-intentioned people are putting out things saying, well, this shows that we can end homelessness in one go. And of course we can, but that's not what's being done in practice.
Well, what is being done in practice?
So in London specifically, we've seen, on the one hand, the Greater London Authority, the Mayor's Office, have done a fairly creditable effort. They've housed around 500 rough sleepers so far. That said, the rough sleeping in hotel rooms or in other forms of self-isolated accommodation. And they've done that. They've also made statements saying that they wouldn't take into account, for example, no recourse to public fund status, so migrant rough sleepers can get support. There have been positive moves in that direction, but with 500 people housed, there are 9,000 people sleeping rough on the streets of London at least. And in addition, most of those 500 who have been housed in a self-isolated accommodation have been moved from crowded hostels into that accommodation. So they've already been engaging with council services. That's kind of the easy bar to clear, is to just move people into those. Yeah. But meanwhile, people sleeping rough on the streets, the numbers haven't really been dented. And like I mentioned before, a lot of people are flocking towards places like Westminster, which already have high rates of coronavirus. A lot of people are still so desperate they're having to beg, if anything, more out on the streets, because outreach groups and volunteer groups are drying up. People can't get food, people can't get drink. A lot of people are hearing rumours about all of these self-isolated accommodation they can get into, but they haven't actually been given any offers of support. Yeah. No, people are getting desperate.
I thought that was interesting. I read the GLA press release very closely. There's actually an article on the East London News website about this putting the homeless in hostels. And it was very carefully worded, I thought, because it said in London there's up to 10,000 rough sleepers. And the first phase of offering the homeless hotel accommodation was the accommodation is being offered to 500 rough sleepers whom we have identified. And I thought, now you've sort of explained that for me, really, because I thought that sounds like people who are already in touch, with the system and leaving the problem largely untouched. So at the moment, it sounds like it's being a little bit superficial or cosmetic, and we need for it to be pushed further, I guess. Do we? Is hotel accommodation, of which there must be a supply at the moment, is that the way to deal with offering rough sleepers some anti-corona protection?
So I think it is a good idea, and it's actually was originally pushed. It didn't just drop down from on high. It was a proposal that was being pushed by grassroots outreach groups, the Museum of Homelessness, Streets Kitchen, and supported by the Labour Homelessness Campaign. The signature demand was block book, or if we had a slightly more radical government, requisition hotel accommodation, which was going to be empty, and then we could house the rough sleepers who need to be housed. It looked for a while like we'd won, and we were sort of hearing reports from charities, or rumours at least, from charities which had government contracts that they were going to be block booking 9,000 hotel rooms, and that this massive progress was going to be made. Things have been a lot slower, certainly, than we would have hoped. I wouldn't necessarily call what's been done cosmetic, because my day job at the minute is in homeless hostels where there are people who are suspected of having coronavirus. People do need to be moved immediately out of crowded hostels to individual isolated rooms, but that is really the extent of what's been done on a large scale. In addition to that, we have seen councils putting in place their own schemes, and some of them are doing pretty good efforts. I would say, point out like Islington have done a decent job. Enfield seem to be doing a decent job as well in housing more people, but the central government contribution to that effort has been very, very little. I think the only additional money that we've seen was around £3.2 million for the entire country, which, if you divvy it up, that's around less than 50 quid per rough sleeper or person in a hospital. So it's nowhere near enough to actually house people. We need urgent support from central government.
Just to remind our listeners, if you would like to ask Tom a question, and he's very knowledgeable about homelessness, you can call into the studio. I know you're shy, but you can call in on 0208 1345 07. I've actually said it right for the first time. That's our number, and you can call in and come on air, ask Tom a question, ask me a question, or tell us what your experience of rough sleeping in the Tower Hamlets or East London area has been like. But that is the next question, Tom. Who's actually paying for this hotel accommodation? The government is talking about having thrown funds at the hotel rooms. Are the hoteliers offering their redundant rooms for free, or who is actually paying for the accommodation?
So in most cases, it is the Greater London Authority or it is councils. I've certainly heard of specific hotels, quite often sort of smaller hotels, which have been offering as donations to NHS staff sometimes, or to those sleeping rough. But I've not heard that really from the larger hotel chains. So yes, I think there are going to be people profiting out of this crisis, and it is going to be the taxpayer dime which is going to be used to fund this, because as usual, the government's attachment to private property rights isn't great news for the taxpayer, and it's certainly not great news for being able to put into a programme at scale actually ending rough sleeping in London, even though we've got this massive humanitarian crisis and all of the other rules seem to be going out the window.
Can we end rough sleeping in London, Tom? How would the Labour campaign on homelessness suggest we go about that?
So we can absolutely end. It is easily, well, not easily, well, fairly easily done, to be honest, to end rough sleeping. What we need, though, is fundamentally an end to. Well, we need restoring funding. Labour's last manifesto had some quite good news on that, with restoring £1 billion per year of additional funding, which is what was been cut out of these services every year since 2010. But we also need fundamentally a rethink of our whole economic system, which is driving people towards rough sleeping. Rents are obviously skyrocketing out of control and are far higher than what people can afford to live in these major cities. So what we can do is end that visible rough sleeping, but that's the easy part. That would require additional funding. That would also require an end to the whole culture of making people jump through hoops. That would require a move towards offering unconditional support. One way that you could help rough sleepers in London would be just block book the hotel rooms and then go out handing out cards and telling people, well, that's your hotel room you can go to. Unfortunately, we've not seen that radical rethink in how things are done, even during this humanitarian crisis when that's absolutely needed. And so people are being told, well, they have to contact StreetLink, and then within 3 to 4 days, someone from StreetLink may come and find them where they're sleeping rough. They can't actually go to access a service where in a building that they know where it is, because those are all closed. They just have to stay in one place, and eventually someone with a mask may come by. But I was on the phone to people sleeping in Westminster Station today. Rough sleeping numbers have increased since the coronavirus crisis started. They don't know how to access support. They've contacted StreetLink to try and get some of them off the streets, but no one's come by in the last few days. And there are rough sleepers sleeping in that station who are exhibiting signs of coronavirus. So people are scared on the streets. The way to end rough sleeping is to unconditionally give people accommodation, and we have £1.2 billion and tens of thousands of empty homes in London. That is doable, but it needs the political will to happen. That's what's missing.
Yes, it's strange, isn't it? The government tells everyone to self-isolate and stay home to save the NHS and stop the spread of corona. But even in the tube station used most often by MPs, there's a whole load of people not obeying that instruction because, as we know, they haven't got a home to go to. But shouldn't the police be coming and arresting them and giving them a nice warm cell to sleep and self-isolate in? Isn't that... shouldn't the police be doing that if they're even-handed?
Well, I mean, it is a concern that we may start to see that. And it may already be happening. I'm not necessarily aware of the additional powers the police have been being used so far to mass arrest or mass fine people experiencing homelessness, but we've definitely seen it in other countries. I saw the other day in Italy, a national coalition of homeless groups has been raising a very justified uproar about police powers being used to massively fine homeless people who had nowhere to self-isolate in. And even after the coronavirus crisis is over, I mean, a lot of the stuff that our campaign has been working on have been stuff like the 1824 Vagrancy Act, which are just laws which can be used blanket to criminalise anyone who is staying out in public without obvious means of sustenance. That's a criminal offence. And if we even remove that requirement and just anyone being in public can be criminalised, and that if these measures are kept in place for longer than they need to be, that's a very definite worry. I know a couple of rough sleepers who have actively attempted to be arrested by police because they've seen no other option to get off the streets. That's how terrified people are right now. I've not necessarily seen, in my own experience so far, abuse of police powers with regard to people experiencing homelessness affected by coronavirus, but that is something that we're keeping a very close eye on.
Well, this borough has suffered quite seriously from laws from the 19th century being applied to our governance and services. You know what I mean, listeners? So we'll gloss over that. I'm wondering, maybe, seeing as I mean, it's difficult because it's a sad situation, and because there are people who work there, have their day jobs there. But as we were able to commandeer the Excel Centre so quickly for up to 4,000 ill people, I wonder, now they've sort of put beds in there and cubicles and so on, perhaps we should call for the authorities to commandeer the Excel Centre permanently until they've ended rough sleeping. And maybe we should have that as a giant East London homeless shelter to offer to homeless people as we attempt to rehouse them in the longer term. Maybe that's the solution. But on the other hand, maybe they need it so they can sell warships to other smaller countries. I suppose East London Excel might be a bit booked. But I suppose the other short-term measure, although it would just put the problem on councils, would be to remove the restrictions on councils' statutory duty to rehouse the homeless. I mean, that would be a very quick and easy step to take, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And we have seen some councils waiving some of their rules on rehousing people experiencing homelessness. So some councils have suspended local connection rules for people who are at risk. Some councils have suspended, a lot of councils suspended no recourse public funds rules officially. We're not always seeing that being answered in practice, and we're seeing people in need who are ringing up council hotlines and being told, no, those rules are still in place. We are seeing people who, I know one person who was a migrant rough sleeper who asked for support from a council and was told, even right now, no, the correct thing for you to do is attempt to return to your home country, which seems slightly absurd.
I'm sorry, I should not laugh because it's serious, but I mean, talk about the left hand of government not knowing what the right hand is doing.
Yeah, it's a really shocking situation. I mean, there's a number of rough sleepers, and you can look them up on Twitter, they've got sort of a running commentary staying in Heathrow Airport who've been denied access of support as well. Like, I don't know. It's becoming very clear that despite the big pronouncements from central government, despite the ambition, I suppose, which they are at least stating, the ambition of the government communicators anyway, which has been lacking before, but which is now thankfully coming into place here, saying, yes, we can end homelessness and we can end rough sleeping. The workings of both local and central government, for the most part, haven't changed. We still haven't seen, I mean, I've been trying to access council rough sleeping services over the weekend, and most of them are closed until Monday morning, which is a bit of a problem when last weekend was meant to be the deadline for housing every rough sleeper in the country. Really? It's kind of, yeah, it's strange to see the disconnect between what you're seeing in the national media and what's actually being done. And to be honest, one of my worries is I've seen a lot of people saying a lot of people who aren't necessarily linked into the situation, but who've seen the news and who are saying, well, everyone I see sleeping rough, they've already been offered a hotel room, so they must have refused it.
Yeah.
And that stigmatization, which is already there, that could just increase.
So the message for our viewers is, if you see a rough person, somebody rough sleeping in Tower Hamlets, in East London or anywhere else in the UK, you should, what should people do?
So a lot of it is, well, I mean, you could offer support. You could stay 2 meters away from them. I think that's probably the smart thing to do right now. But you could ask them whether they want to be referred to StreetLink. We have previously had concerns about the workings of StreetLink just because of potential data sharing of some migrant rough sleepers' information with the Home Office. So we normally ask for people's consent before referring them to that service. But it is the one way to get people off the streets. And so you could ask, well, can I help refer you to StreetLink? I mean, they may still, it's quite likely that it would be useful for them to have something from a local corner shop, have something to eat. You might have to queue for a little bit longer, but just be kind to them like we would urge you to be in any other circumstance. Just maybe keep a few more feet apart.
Yes, you make me remember a time a few months ago when I fell over on the street. I know what to do when I fall over, which is to lie there and mentally count my digits and limbs until I've worked out if I'm okay. But I didn't have time to do that because people came up and helped me very, very quickly before I knew what was going on. People calling ambulances and just trying to help and watch. But obviously I was, somebody in the middle of the day lying on an open pavement. And it would be nice to think that anybody lying on a pavement could have the same kindness from the passing population. That's very right. Okay, Tom, you've been a very entertaining and interesting guest. We're coming to the end of our time on air now. So I just wanted to ask you, have you had your leaflet from John Biggs? Has it reached where you are now?
I think there is a stack of them lying outside the block of flats I'm in, but I've not managed to get around to picking it up yet. I will make sure to read it with great interest.
Okay, that's fine. I see that sadly it doesn't have the telephone number for vulnerable people on it. It just has the normal Tower Hamlets Council phone numbers, which, as anyone who's tried to ring the council in the last few years will know, leads you through to a robot which is determined not to understand where you're going. There's a woman called Louise who works for the council who gets a number of my calls to the press office. But there we go. So we would like to remind listeners that vulnerable people in Tower Hamlets who need a hand, who are worried and can't leave home but need something, the council helpline for them is 0207 364, which is how all council numbers start, and then 3030. 0207 364 3030. Maybe you could try that with some of your homeless contacts, Tom. Do come back and join us again another day on 2020 Vision. We're hoping to be on every Tuesday at 7 o'clock, although obviously we have scope for maybe some special editions concentrating on issues, and although Corona has sort of closed down much of society, there's still quite a lot going on, as you've sort of explained, from the front line. So thank you for that, and in a second we'll let you go and you can do that washing up that's been waiting for you. Just a couple of last reminder to our listeners: be careful with hand sanitizer. There's a few things doing the rounds on social media where people have been burnt as a result of using alcohol-based hand sanitizer and then going into a kitchen or near an open flame. So be very careful with your hand sanitizer if you're using that. And look out on social media for, I think, one of the best cartoons of the week, which is Boris Johnson phoning the Queen and telling her that he has coronavirus and saying what should he do, whereupon her reply is, go touch Donald Trump. So very sound advice. Let's hope he takes it. Thank you to our viewers for watching. We'll see you all next week. Ring us or email us if you have any suggestions of topics you'd like us to cover. But from us for now, that's good night.